There we go. If everyone can mute themselves when they're popping in, that would be great. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Amy Pollard. I'm the Executive Director of the AAUP. We just want to thank everyone for coming to hear Ellen Cassedy speak. We're really excited about it. And we're going to do a Q&A at the end. And so for that, you can either ask your questions in the chat, you can raise your hand, ask your questions. If you want to ask them anonymously, you can just send them directly to me in the chat and I'm happy to answer them. But just thank you to Tom DeSena for bringing this opportunity to us. And thank you also for the two other groups who are co-sponsoring this, Communication, Journalism and Public PR Department, as well as the Women and Gender Studies group. So thank you for that. And then Tom, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Okay. So I've been asked to provide a short introduction. And I talked it over with Ellen first. I apologize in advance if it gets a little personal, but I'm going to kick off. So I had, of course, heard of the 9 to 5 movement before reading Ellen's account of it in Working 9 to 5, a women's movement, a labor union, and the iconic movie. And still, the book itself was absolutely a revelation, accomplishing so much in a compressed space that it is almost bewildering. First, I think it can be productively read as social history. It documents both a time in our history that is really scarcely imaginable, I think, to our students. For instance, the existence of classified ads separated by sex, while also describing the upending of that world and its gradual and uneven transformation. It's also a deeply affecting memoir that recounts with honesty and grace the joys, sorrows, triumphs, and hardships that come with the work of, as people in my field call it, moving the social. I expect that many of you who have read it will, like me, feel a pang of jealousy as you read the stories of Ellen and her fellow activists planning, arguing, and commiserating in the cramped offices of a YWCA across from the John Hancock Tower in Boston. I think it can also be productively read as a kind of a strategy manual, a pragmatic primer, if you will, for doing the work of social change, kind of like Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, but in a less didactic mode and with a far greater sense of humility, but no less an ambitious dedication to upending social norms and fighting for social justice. So for all of these reasons, I read 9 to 5 very slowly. Pausing frequently to consider and reflect on Ellen Cassedy's words. But my pauses were occasioned by other thoughts as well, as I found myself thinking frequently about my mother. Via a certificate program offered then at Wayne State University, and a note here to any of our university administrators, certificate programs are not terribly original. It didn't start with you. Mom was a certified professional secretary. Her career spanned the decades covered in Ellen Cassedy's book, and while I hate thinking that she might have been asked to catalog blowjobs or sew some boorish boss's pants, I know that she experienced many of the changes that are described in these pages. Mom worked for a time at Wayne State, where on at least one occasion, she brought me and my sister to make a nuisance of ourselves by chasing each other around the pillars of the upside-down birthday cake education building. I've always expected there was something formative about that experience, as both of us went on to earn PhDs and we both work in higher education. She did piecework. She did piecework at home, typing late into the night on an IBM Selectric, sometimes in a nook in the room where I slept. For a while, she temped. She was the quintessential Kelly girl of the 1980s. I don't know what she was paid, but I never had any doubt that she was a professional and that she commanded the dignity and respect that befits being a professional. So I was especially struck by a line from Ellen Cassedy's book where she quotes an answer to a survey. "We are referred to as girls," another woman wrote, "until we retire without a pension." Well, by the time my mom retired, the world had changed, largely, I think, because of some of the things that Ellen Cassedy and the 9 to 5 movement brought about. No one called her a girl then. They called her a director, and she had a fully funded retirement. There was a ceremony to celebrate her career, and my then 3-year-old son watched as she commanded the attention of a throng gathered to honor her and shouted "Grandma" as she gave her speech. I expect that experience will be as important to him as playing at a university was for me. I don't think he will ever be able to see women as anything other than deserving of respect. The world had unalterably changed by then, and I don't think it's overstating things to suggest that we have Ellen Cassedy and the 9 to 5 movement to thank for much of that change. I know I owe her a debt of gratitude for what she made possible, and I know that I'm not the only one whose life has been positively influenced because the 9 to 5ers made it possible for women office workers to be treated with decency, even if, of course, there is much more work to be done. So please join me in welcoming Ellen Cassedy to Oakland University.
Wow. Well, I'm in tears. Thank you, Tom. That was really moving, every word of it. I can tell you teach communications for one thing. Thank you to Amy Pollard and the faculty union here at Oakland. And thanks to everyone for being here, including members of the clerical and technical staff, and all of you. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. We're coming to the end of Women's History Month, a time to remember and to honor the chain of working women's activism that is our legacy from the past, the chain that inspires us in what we do today, the chain that is constantly being forged anew on into the future. And I'm going to talk now about how we women of 9 to 5 forged our link in the chain, and a little about some of the new links that are being forged today in new and exciting ways. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. All right. 50 years ago, on a cold December morning, I was one of 10 women office workers who fanned out across downtown Boston to pass out the first issue of the 9 to 5 newsletter. And the front page said this: "We keep Boston's businesses and institutions running smoothly. Without us, they would grind to a halt. Yet we are underpaid and undervalued." That's how my book begins, with the 10 of us shivering on street corners. I wanted to write the kind of book I was hungry for when I was starting out, a book that, as I sometimes say, was up close and universal. I wanted to create an intimate perch from which to explore the larger world of a movement for social change. And I wanted to interweave organizing lore, humor, economic and social history, the 9 to 5 story, and today's exuberant labor activism. I wanted to convey what it was like to work in a tiny beehive of an office at the YWCA for 12 hours a day, full of dreams and passion and energy, and what it was like to see women joining together, growing together, and winning together. I also wanted to tell the story in a way that would be super accessible to students. So let me tell you the story now. I was 22 years old, working as a clerk typist at Harvard University. That's me on the left. It was my first job out of college. And a group of us started sitting around in a circle and talking about our jobs: low pay, unequal pay, training men to be our own supervisors, and having to do favors, all kinds of favors for our bosses. The lack of respect, as Tom said, as one woman said, they call us girls until the day we retire without pension. And I think it all hit home for us one day when a student walked into the office, looked one of us straight in the eye and said, "Isn't anybody here?" "Well, I'm here. Can't you see me?" At that time, when people thought worker, they pictured a man in a hard hat wielding a wrench. Women workers, especially office workers, were virtually invisible. But in the early 1970s, that was changing. Millions of women were pouring into the workforce, and 1 in 3 was an office worker. And as the clerical workforce grew by leaps and bounds, so did a sense of injustice among the women whose job it was to type and file and staple and mimeograph and photocopy. We wanted our rights and we wanted respect. Our goal was not just to get women out of the typing pool, but to make the typing pool a better place to work. As Elise Bryant, the director of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, says, there are no menial jobs, just menial pay. And we sensed that we had our finger on the pulse of something very powerful, and our dreams were huge. We were keenly aware of that change of working women's activism that stretched back to the garment women of the turn of the 20th century, the women who went on strike by the tens of thousands and galvanized the labor movement of their day, the brave women who supported the sit-down strikers of the steel and auto industries in the 1930s and 40s, and on up through the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s and the women's liberation movement, whose ideas had seeped into every corner of American society. Maybe we thought, maybe now it was our turn to forge our link in the chain. Maybe we could change the modern office, change the labor movement, change the world. We thought big. But women who worked in offices were scared to take action, and rightfully so. In the downtown office workforce, there was little or no history of collective action. When you had a problem, you were likely to think of it as your individual personal problem. Maybe you should dress better or take a class. That's the American way, right? For most office workers, the idea of sitting down across the table with management and negotiating over pay and benefits was unimaginable. And of course, employers were intent on keeping it that way. The working conditions were very authoritarian. You could not leave your cubicle and go talk to someone else across the room without your supervisor noticing. And when we handed out our leaflets outside the big skyscrapers, inside the revolving doors, there would be supervisors waiting to snatch those leaflets right out of women's hands. So how are we going to get off the ground? Well, we started small. We started with lunch. We called up all the women who had written us in response to the newsletter and invited them to lunch at a little downtown diner or cafeteria. Sometimes I ate 3 lunches in one day. And that's how I learned a very important principle of organizing, which is never bring an artichoke to a recruitment lunch. The heart of every lunch was listening to what our lunchmates were concerned about, how they spoke, the words they used. Many women told us in no uncertain terms that they did not consider themselves feminists. So, okay, we could live with that. We didn't let vocabulary get in the way of solidarity. It wasn't long before we called our first public meeting and our organization took off. Our strategy, as it developed, had 3 prongs. First, we worked like crazy to get in the media. We took over National Secretary's Day, the 3rd Wednesday in April. Instead of a nice box of chocolates or a bouquet of roses, we wanted our rights 365 days a year, raises, not roses. We held bad boss contests, and the TV cameras rolled as we confronted the boss who asked his secretary to sew up a hole in his pants while he was wearing them, and the lawyer who fired his secretary for bringing him a corned beef sandwich on white bread instead of rye. We called out the boss who handed his secretary a suspicious package saying, "This might be a letter bomb." And you know his next words, right? "You open it." The expression sexual harassment hadn't yet been coined, but that didn't mean it wasn't happening. Our view was that sexual harassment was an emblem of women's lack of power and equal rights on the job, and that the more women joined together for dignity and equality at the workplace, the less sexual harassment would take place. The guidelines we created for employers, for women, for their male coworkers, helped pave the way for the Me Too movement. So media attention was prong number 1, public embarrassment. The second prong was government action. It was easier for women to confront a public official than to confront their own boss. So we showed up en masse in the offices of the anti-discrimination enforcers and demanded that they use their powers to the max, and many did. The third prong, I guess you could call whistleblowers, coming up with safe ways for women to speak up and be heard without losing their jobs. And it all came together. Basically, we perfected the art of raising a ruckus. You couldn't avoid us. A group of people who had been unseen and unlistened to started demanding the recognition we deserved. And I think the way some bosses saw it was that the wallpaper had come alive and things began to change. Countless bosses started getting their own coffee. A group of women at an insurance company worked up the courage to circulate a petition demanding higher pay and a host of other demands. After 3 days, their boss caught them at it, and he held up the petition for everyone to see. He said, "You know what we do with these things? They go right in the trash." Plunk. 3 days later, all their demands were met. Soon we were taking on the biggest and the baddest corporate titans and driving them mad. We took on the biggest bank in town, the First National Bank of Boston, and declared 1979 the year of the first. We set up an anonymous hotline just for employees of the First National Bank. And on the first day of our campaign, we were out in front of the bank handing out a survey, asking people to tell us what it was like to work there. A couple of days later, we were out in front of the bank again with another leaflet telling the results of that survey and what people had told us on the hotline. So it was all safe, all anonymous, but it was powerful. The bank immediately announced they were instituting job posting, which was our first demand. First victory at the first. And by the end of the year of the first, we had won promotions, career ladders, a grievance procedure, and the biggest raise in bank history. We announced our next target, the biggest insurance company, the John Hancock. And that night, one particular executive decided that he'd better spend all night in his office, just in case. In case what? In case we invaded, I suppose. We didn't invade. But in response to our pressure, the company handed out a huge raise. And for the first time ever, they allocated money for employee childcare. Across the city, we won millions of dollars in back pay and raises. And I can't tell you how exciting it was. Actually, my book does tell you how exciting it was. It was really exciting. As historian Lane Wyndham has said, they created their own form of feminism, a workplace feminism, and it was powerful. Women all over the country, had the same problems and the same dreams. We formed a national association with members in every state and chapters in dozens of cities. And we made a point of targeting cities with diverse workforces in order to build a multiracial organization. Baltimore, Cleveland, Atlanta. We placed a priority on building a diverse membership, leadership, and staff that would reflect the makeup of the clerical workforce. And that's something that didn't just happen. It took conscious work, and it's something I'm very proud of. Jane Fonda came to us and said she wanted to make a movie based on our demands and our concerns. Needless to say, we were thrilled. She brought her team to meet with our members, and they popped a question we had never thought to ask in all those recruitment lunches, which was, have you ever fantasized about doing in your boss? Well, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room just exploded because it turned out everybody had, and all those fantasies went right into the script. The movie was a huge box office success in 1980, and Dolly Parton's toe-tapping anthem said it all. It was our movement that inspired that movie, and the movie in turn gave our movement a huge boost. After the movie came out, we had won the debate. Now it was time to consolidate our power. And that meant going national with our union. So over the past years, we had become skilled at using community organizing tactics to make big changes for women workers. Our style of working feminism was powerful, and it allowed us to win the kind of victories that unions win. But remember, we were not a union, and we knew that only through a union contract do you get it in writing, guaranteed. Workers and unions earn higher pay, have better benefits, and a say over working conditions. In 1981, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, granted us a nationwide charter for our woman-led union, and our union, District 925, got off the ground all over the country. By adding union muscle to the mix, we maximized our power. We won great contracts and brought thousands of women into the labor movement. And one of those women was Carol Sims in Cleveland. I'm going to show you a couple of minutes from the documentary called 9 to 5, The Story of a Movement. It's on PBS and Netflix. And if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. So here is Carol.
I worked at the corporate office, which I always called it the big house, because that's where all the bosses, the president of the college, the assistant, everybody was there. You could not talk about the union at all. That was a no-no. 925 had a demonstration right outside. All my team of workers, they were all looking out the window like, management was listening, trying to see where everybody was at. Management would fire you. I had to figure out whether I was gonna go out or stay in. I watched people get mistreated in that office and belittled, and so I just felt like I'm not gonna just sit this out. I just decided this is something I have to do. And when I came back, I felt like I was normal Ray. They were like, "Yeah, all right," but they were doing it like in the corner in the bathroom, or they'll come by my desk like, "All right, Carol," like, "All right." So from that day on, I had a real interest in change. I became an organizer.
Not just SEIU, but many other unions invested new resources in organizing women workers, and they discovered that union drives in woman-dominated workplaces, especially those with a high percentage of Black women, were more likely to succeed. And that was a surprise to those who told us early on, forget it, women couldn't be organized. They could be, and they were. Just like every union in the 1980s and beyond, we encountered ferocious opposition from employers. Employers were bound and determined not to put up with unions. They tried every trick in the book, legal and illegal, firings, captive audience meetings, moving out of town, intimidation. And in response, we came up with some pretty clever tactics of our own. At the University of Washington in Seattle, what turned out to work was making Tampax machines a major issue at the bargaining table. Yes, we did want more Tampax machines at the work site, but the real reason we kept talking about Tampax was that every time we used the word Tampax, the management negotiators got so flustered that some of them had to leave the room, and we won a great contract. So what did we achieve, and what remains to be done? Issues that used to be considered individual matters are now matters of policy, corporate policy, government policy, union policy. Pregnancy discrimination is illegal today. Sexual harassment is illegal. We have the Family and Medical Leave Act. We don't have help wanted male and help wanted female ads in the newspapers anymore. Managerial jobs are now increasingly open to college-educated women. Within the labor movement, women have risen to the top, including Liz Schuler, the first woman president of the AFL-CIO. But as we know, it can be harder to be a worker today than it was 50 years ago. Low-paying, dead-end jobs are still with us, and women and people of color are more likely to remain stuck in them. Some people are working 2 and 3 jobs just to put food on the table. Fewer people have benefits, pensions, paid vacation, paid sick time, regular schedules. There's computerized monitoring and a relentless pace of work. The gender gap in pay is stuck at 82% and much worse for women of color. The good news is the new wave of labor organizing that we see across the country. Support for unions is now at its highest level in 2 generations. 71% of Americans now support unions. We're hearing new voices and seeing new tactics. What's making headlines is a blend of the traditional workplace by workplace elections that many unions pursue, plus the more freewheeling public and community approach of 9 to 5. And I think that blend is where the future success of the labor movement will be found. The barbecues by the Amazon workers, the sip-ins at Starbucks, coworker.org that helps you start a union if you don't have one, one fair wage for tipped workers, the National Domestic Workers Alliance, 9 to 5 is still reaching out to women in every state. These are the people who are forging today's links in the chain, and more power to them. In conclusion, while I was doing the research for my book, I opened up a box of old papers and I found a little quote that I'd clipped out of a magazine. And it said, "Through our great good fortune, in our youth, we were touched with fire." And that's what it was like for me and for so many of us in the working women's movement. So I have to say, I do have hope for the future. Just as we 9-to-5ers were inspired to break new ground by those who came before us, my hope is that those striving for fair treatment and a better world today will draw inspiration from what we did, learn from 9-to-5, read my book, but then go on to forge their own path, their own link in the chain. There's an old labor song that says, freedom, freedom is a hard-won thing. You've got to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation's got to win it again. Thank you. So I welcome your questions, your comments, and I think Amy is going to be curating this part of the conversation.
I will. Thank you so much for that, Ellen. That was great. I love, there's a lot of heavy stuff in organizing and the labor movement. So it's nice to hear the sort of humorous moments as well. I can just picture the idea of just repeating the word Tampax and making everyone incredibly uncomfortable. So I appreciate that. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'll call on you, or you can put it in the chat privately to me or publicly, whichever you prefer. Go ahead, Dan.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ellen. Oh, now something covered my screen. I just wondered, you mentioned that 9-to-5 was able to affiliate with SEIU, but I wondered if you could talk a bit more about how welcoming you found most unions when you were trying to find some union to affiliate with.
Great question. When we first started out, we knew that there were going to be unions in our future, and we weren't sure how it was going to work out. At first, we thought we would just kind of find women everywhere around the city of Boston who wanted to unionize, and we just call up some union and say, here they are, come get them. That did not turn out to be true for two reasons. One was that women office workers in the downtown workforce in private industry were by and large did not feel, oh yes, a union, yes, I want to do that. Even though, just regardless of whether their employer wanted it or not, they were not really ready for it, did not see themselves as doing that. They didn't have any history of it, as I said. And then when we went around and talked to unions, we talked to all the union officials we could find. Most of them were men, vast majority. And they couldn't quite wrap their minds around what we were talking about. We went in there and we said, there's this huge unorganized sector of the economy that's sitting there unorganized, get out there. And at that time, early 70s, most unions were not organizing anybody. And secondly, we heard all kinds of very off-putting remarks from these union officials. Women can't be organized. One union official said, actually, that's a great idea. And if I could find a girl to come in here and do my typing, I'd be out there in the field with you. That was not what we were looking for. So we went around, we interviewed various unions, we drew up a budget, we took it to one particular union, said, can you fund this? And they would not, nobody would do it. And then over a period of a couple of years, we talked with the Service Employees International Union. They were one of the few unions that was doing organizing and was doing it in the private as well as the public sector. And we found a good home there. And they were open to everything we had in mind, coast to coast. We hire our own organizers. We decide what they're going to get paid. We decide which campaigns we're doing. So we started out with 5 organizers from coast to coast. It was insane, let me just say. These organizers got running around the country and starting a campaign here and a campaign there. And we got a lot going doing that. And it was not what we expected. It was not based in the finance industries, which we thought, that's the heart of the clerical economy. That's where we were going to end up. But it was way too hard. And so we ended up mostly organizing in public entities like universities, Head Start, libraries, and so on. And the thing is, we eventually got up to 10,000 members, which is not bad. it's not big enough. And it was not, 20 million, which was women office workers across the country. But I think we functioned as a kind of demonstration project. And a lot of other unions were sort of looking out of the side of their eye and thinking, maybe we could do that. And organizing really did pick up in general, and also among office workers in many different unions.
Thanks, Dan. Other questions? I actually had a question about, you talked about work, unionizing workers at academic institutions. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the difference of organizing at an academic institution versus, a bank or a financial institution. Because I do think from our perspective, one of the issues is that we aren't at an institution that's this for-profit that's making millions and millions and millions of dollars versus, banks and financial corporations that are making these obscene amounts of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was, well, one thing was that banks and insurance companies just threw money at us, and they were afraid of a union, and they figured, we thought it was going to be really hard to get money out of them, and we should sort of try these softer things like job posting and career ladders, which actually turned out to be things that they were more resistant to. Sure, money, you want money? Sure, here's some money. But those things about how you make decisions and how the place is run, that really got them, and they didn't want to do that. But one thing was that across the board, the places we were organizing hired anti-union consultants to run their anti-union campaigns, and they were vicious. And universities were right in there. They, these supposedly liberal institutions hired these expensive consulting firms to go after the organizers, to fire people, to, run these very sophisticated communications campaigns. And we were quite surprised that we thought universities would be pretty easy to unionize because they, of course, they believed in freedom of expression, and they already had, a lot of them had buildings and grounds unions, and of course they'd be willing to do. They were not. The Harvard campaign took 15 years. It started when I was a clerk typist at Harvard, and it wasn't until 1988 that they won a union there, and Harvard resisted every single step of the way. A difference is that today, many universities are unionized. The clerical staff is unionized. And it was hard going, but it did happen. Whereas banks and insurance companies remain unorganized for the most part. Public clerical workers are much more likely to be organized. And when you say, you make this distinction between the companies that are rich and making money hand over fist, well, a lot of those private universities fall into that category. They are not only educational institutions, but they are massive real estate empires, and they have plenty of money. They have huge endowments, and they can afford it. They can afford to pay their office workers good wages and good respectful wages, and they don't. So let me just make one more comment, which is the working conditions. At a university, as you probably know, you can get up from your desk and go talk to somebody across the room. You can often take a course for free. The dress code is more casual. You can sometimes come in later, leave early. And those perks, and also the sort of feeling that you're doing good, that you're educating people, that you're contributing to important research, these are things that matter to people, and that sometimes cause office workers to think, well, all right, those things are so good that I'm really glad I'm working here rather than another place. And so I think office workers in universities are sometimes reluctant to tamper with that and to think, all right, I'm going for a union. And of course, the employers kind of double down on that and make people feel kind of guilty for disturbing the great employee-employer relationship. My feeling is that a union helps that relationship, and that the added voice of the employees is a plus for an institution that makes a university or any place work better. So those are some things. I welcome your comments about that or anything else.
Thank you. Karen?
unmute.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I just have a question, and I want to just have you sort of check me or not. I was involved in a clerical organizing effort at Columbia University in the 1970s,
Mhm.
and it was run through the UAW. And we all thought it was kind of odd that the UAW was doing this. And ultimately, well, I shouldn't say ultimately, because it did eventually get better, but our effort failed. And I always kind of allowed that to the fact that the folks who were trying to help us were more from the traditional assembly and manufacturing sectors. They knew how to organize those kinds of workers. And you know, your experience is so much more positive, and I think it's because so many of you kind of, it was more of a grassroots. And I'm just wondering, you know, what are your reflections on that? And is that what sort of broke through in terms of being able to organize secretaries, or it was just because you were so fantastic at your jobs in organizing?
That's a great question. And the UAW, I think I just read that like 20% of their members are now like university workers and, you know, museum workers and so on. So there's nothing to say that that can't happen. I think we were really, really conscious of staying really close to what were the concerns of the people we were seeking to organize. And it didn't necessarily come naturally. We had to learn that, and we had to let go of a lot of assumptions. You know, when we started out, we thought groups of women would band together and go storming into their bosses' offices and demanding things. And by and large, that didn't happen. And we had to dream up the ways that people would feel comfortable doing things like the bad boss contest, or like picketing somebody else's bank, or filling out a survey anonymously, or whatever it was. And you know, we were very careful with our union to make sure that we just listened so carefully. And what do people care about? We're not going by some template that had to do with how people used to organize. We're gonna like make use of the knowledge and wisdom of our SEIU union, but we're gonna really tailor it to what people are really talking about and how they're talking about it. So that Columbia Drive, I think it did succeed, but a union is the workers. And if a union comes in, starts passing out cards and here's our organizer, here's our president, here's what we're doing, just sign up here, it's not going to work. It doesn't work anywhere. And yes, the history of unions in America has been based more in industry, heavy industry or garment industry or whatever but whenever you move into a new field, you have to gear it to that new field. And that began to happen, but the Columbia situation was one of the first. And so it took a while.
Thank you. Tom?
There's a question in the chat.
I have
If you want
I have a
to-
couple questions in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Well, some have been
so-
sent directly to me. Did you have a question too, Tom?
Yeah, just maybe even more of a comment, but I was struck what you just said about the, you know, sort of the traditional industrial unions organizing non-industrial workers. My grandfather was the president of his UAW local, and I wrote my dissertation on, at least in part, the UAW's first efforts to organize at the University of California system. And I can still remember he was in his 80s and he was looking at my dissertation. He started to read it, which I didn't expect, and it had some bad language at the beginning that I was a little embarrassed to have my grandfather read. But he's going through it and he's like, the UAW does this? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, who at Solidarity House talks to these people? And I, you know, it's like that's, you know, that's sort of the question that you just brought up, right? It's like, who, you know, who does that work? But the other thing that struck me is in the video clip that you showed was Carol Sims.
Mm-hmm.
What brought her down to the protest was that she looked around the office and saw other people being mistreated. right? Like the
Exactly.
thing that moved her wasn't something that affected her. And the thing that resonated for me about that is that when my grandfather talked about why he joined the UAW, it was because of the same thing, that someone that he worked with was mistreated, and
I was
that's
looking at
what got
listening
him
to
to
this
join.
thing
It
about
wasn't a
women in the
problem for him.
workplace.
It was
Kind of
just
interesting.
that's what brought him to the union. And so that sense of like caring about other people, I think is at least as important as anything else. Sorry, I'll just shut up now.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's always a mix. There are always people who are there on behalf of others. And then there are people who are there because they feel it really deeply themselves. I think for me, it was both. Yeah.
I think I can speak to the fact that I get way more upset when when our faculty members get mistreated, I get furious. And I think that's important. I have a question from a faculty member who has a student using feminist methods to study menopause education and healthcare. And she wondered if you had any references that student could turn to besides your amazing book.
Well, the National Women's Health Network is an online resource that looks at healthcare from a feminist point of view. So that might be a good place to turn.
Terrific. And then another question, which I don't know, it's talking about that there's all these changes that have happened that have been really positive with FMLA and whatnot, but then basically the end of the question sort of says, however, given the current divide in our society about views regarding parenting, school content, etc., I want to feel hopeful, but so I think the question basically is, how do we maintain that sense of hopefulness moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to not sugarcoat, and there are some really big challenges that we face today. There are whole new challenges in the workforce that we hadn't even dreamed of back then, like computerized monitoring, like the gig economy. But I feel that today, that every era gives birth to its own organizers and activists who are going to figure this out. And it's not for me to say, okay, here's how we did it, so just do that. That's not the way it works. You learn from the past and then you build on it and you figure out your new tactics, just the way we did. And nobody had ever done what we had done before. We didn't know what we were doing, but we just went forward. As far as family and work, I think it is shocking that our country is so rigid about making allowances for people being able to both have a family and work. And I think it's the heart of the wage gap today. Yes, there's discrimination. Yes, there's occupational segregation, but a huge part of it is that women in particular have to take time off to raise their children. And the economy is absolutely unbending and inflexible about that. If you take time off, you are going to lose out. And it's true in academia. It's true all over the economy. And that's got to change. I mean, there's no other country that's like that. No, advanced, industrialized, major country that treats family concerns the way our economy does. So something's got to bend there. And I'm hoping that we're going to see some change in that direction and that people are going to figure that out. Today's activists or tomorrow's activists are going to figure that out.
I have another question in the chat to me. Could you speak more to the 9 to 5's movement's deliberate efforts to build a multiracial coalition? What motivated that? And then how do you think that would strengthen the efforts today? And do you see sort of organizing today as less invested in racial unity and justice than in your time?
So Boston was a largely white city when we got started, and there was a lot of racial tension, especially over busing of school children. But within the downtown office workforce, there were very few people of color. And it was only at 5 p.m. that those people turned out to clean the offices, but they were not in the office workforce per se. And we knew that if our effort was going to go nationwide, That was not true of the office workforce nationwide. There were people of color in the office workforce, and we really wanted to be representative of the nationwide office workforce. So we knew that we had to make sure that our membership, our leadership, our staff all looked like the workforce we wanted to organize. That's particularly true in union organizing, where you absolutely have to reach out to every single corner of the workplace and make sure that you represent people from all parts of the workplace. Not so true with 9 to 5, where we could sort of gather random people here and there and make a big hullabaloo with whoever we had. But we were very conscious that we wanted to build a multiracial and multi-age and multi-class organization. And that meant talking about race discrimination in the same breath with sex discrimination. It meant when we hired people, we wanted to have a diverse staff. It meant really making an effort to make sure that we were reaching everybody. And sometimes we paired people of different races and went out together to recruit. In our union organizing, sometimes our Black organizers got kind of a harsh blast of hostility from some of the white workers that they went to organize. And they would come back to the office and say, I don't really feel comfortable there. And we made sure that they felt really supported by everybody in the organization. And maybe that meant going out in pairs or whatever. It did not mean, okay, well, don't go there. We're not going to send a Black organizer to organize white workers. We, embodied the principles of multiracial culture and society that we ourselves felt very strongly about. As for today, I feel like what really mattered was that we were in it together and we linked arms and we went forward, and our focus was on that boss and how we could get better policies in that workplace. And people had new experiences working with kinds of people that they wouldn't have been around, wouldn't have worked with, wouldn't have gotten to know. So our union was really a great sort of fertile breeding ground for some great experiences for people of all races.
Thank you. Other questions, comments? I could ask you questions all day. In your chapter, when you talk about starting up, you have this great page where you list a bunch of questions that you considered as a group to sort of form your identity. And one of the things that I find interesting about that, and maybe kind of difficult, is how do you at one time sort of form your identity as a group? And that means there has to be some sort of this is us, while at the same time building solidarity with this broader picture, because that's where the strength really comes from. So that sort of push and pull, and you even talked about you wanting this book to be something where you looked up close and you looked universal. And that interplay, I think, is really important, but also very tricky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So who was this organization for? Was it only for women? Was it only for women in certain lower level jobs? Could management women join? Could men join? Should we focus on people who were ready to take action right away? Or how could we sort of open up to a little bit beyond those people who are the most ready and the most radical? And I had come out of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement, and those were places where you see that same push and pull. Are we going to do the most, like take the few people who are ready to really go for it and have them be the leaders? Or how can we reach out beyond that? How can we, go as mainstream as possible, sort of push the edge of the possible? That was what was so exciting and interesting. And I think that happened every day. We were making decisions of that nature. And I talk about how when I was organizing women in publishing, I had my own ideas about what those women should do and what their attitude should be and so on. And there was this one day when we were thinking about going to the Boston Globe Book Festival, where there were going to be thousands of people. It was going to be a great place for us to get publicity for our organization. And I said, oh, great, let's throw up a picket line around the festival. And I looked around, you could have heard a pin drop. Nobody said anything. I thought, oh, and then somebody said, how about if we rent a table? And everybody thought that was a great idea. And they all wanted to sign up and staff the table. And in time, people who were not willing to do something that was confrontational became ready to do something that was confrontational. And we filed a lawsuit and we won more than $1 million. And we had women going in groups and talking with management. And, step by step, people became ready for things that they weren't ready for at first. And it was a real lesson for me as an organizer that even though I was so nervous that, they were just being so timid, they were right. They knew what they were ready for. They knew that you take it slow and you take it step by step. And by sort of stepping back myself and allowing that process to go forward, that was what really worked.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. Sort of meeting people where they are.
Mhm.
You mentioned, I do. You mentioned the Me Too movement, and I was really just interested in your perspective and just comments and thoughts that you had, maybe even parallels between the Me Too movement and the 9 to 5 movement.
Great question. Can you mute? Thank you. Okay, so the Me Too movement has something in common with the 9 to 5 movement in that they raised a hullabaloo, and they, even though they weren't they certainly weren't going workplace by workplace, but they just made an amazing use of the media, and everybody knew about them, and they used the power of public embarrassment to really make change. And that's really similar to what we did. I think that we didn't call out the issue of sexual harassment per se. For one thing, the phrase didn't even exist at that time. But our view was that, as I said, where women have power in the workplace, sexual harassment will decrease. And I did write a book with my colleague Ellen Bravo about combating sexual harassment, in which we laid out these guidelines for women. How are women going to respond? What should they do? How can women join together to make a response to sexual harassment? And what questions men should ask themselves? What can management do? So I think Me Too has really made huge changes, just as the 9 to 5 movement has. And they're not necessarily workplace by workplace changes, but I think our whole understanding of those issues has really undergone a big transformation. And that's a great thing.
Ken, we'll give the last question to you because we're getting close to 1 o'clock here.
Quick question. I've always, in my union here, have learned that publicity, if it's on your side and things are public enough, can really sway your employer. What have you learned, I guess, about, of course, you need to get the press, whether it's TV or newspapers, to pay attention and help get your story out. Any pearls of wisdom on that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the Starbucks workers, only a minority of Starbucks workers today are actually organizing union drives. I mean, it's 200 stores, but that's like a tiny percentage of the nationwide company. But everybody knows about it. And I think that that publicity is really driving that campaign. And without it, probably nothing would be happening, that there would be these tiny little stores and no one would know about it. And it would be easy for the, management, which definitely does not want unions, to just put a stop to it. So I guess what I would say is we studied the media really carefully, and we learned how to write the kind of press release that you have to write. In those days, you would write a press release and mail it. Make phone calls to the media outlets, and we we tried to be as sort of media friendly as we could be and really figure out what do they need, what do they want, and it meant educating them too. At first, they weren't, what's this? But we came, and then we had to keep pushing ourselves, like, okay, they've already seen this, now what? Now we have to construct a giant coffee cup and move it into the downtown plaza, or how can we, just tried to be creative about it, and it worked.
Thanks, Ken. I think we can probably wrap up there. Just want to again thank Tom and Aaron and Kathy and Amy for all helping bring this together today. And a huge thank you to you, Ellen. This was wonderful. Really appreciated it. I think everyone here learned a lot. And I really appreciate seeing a couple students here and seeing a lot of our CTs, fellow CT members here. So that's really terrific. We appreciate that. Tom, did you want to say anything to finish up?
No, just thank you again for everything.
And I just want to say, read my book. You can get my book anywhere books are sold, and there's a educator discount and a bulk discount, and you can get a review copy if you're a faculty member. So yeah, Amy is posting that information, and really great to talk with all of you. Really, questions were fantastic, and great. Sounds like a great place.
It's terrific. It's super motivating. Makes me want to get out there and do more. So we really appreciate it.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks again.